Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, Russia seizes control of Libya's biggest oil field. Despite losing ground, Moscow floods Libya with warplanes and Russian mercenaries. Currency crisis, debt default and hyperinflation, Lebanon's economic paralysis, and the devastating explosion. So, is it time for a Marshall Fund? Weaponizing data and disinformation to manipulate elections, hostile nations are using artificial intelligence to get past the best social media defenses. Well, despite being driven out of eastern Libya by government forces backed by Turkey, warlord Khalifa Hafter continues to blockade the country's oil exports and, with the support of Russian mercenaries, is seizing control of the country's oil fields and its ports, starving the country of much-needed financial resources. Well, Haftar has always had the support of Russia, France and the United Arab Emirates, but as Russia steps up its reach around the Mediterranean and Africa, it's increased tensions between Moscow and Washington. The United States military has taken the extraordinary steps of cataloguing and releasing satellite imagery. In May, 14 MiG-29s and several Su-24s were flown from Russia to Syria before being flown to Libya. It's thought they're being piloted by private military contractors. Russian private military group Wagner, which has close links to the Kremlin, has about 2,000 personnel in country and is said to be supported by other foreign militias. The Wagner group has enabled Haftar to seize control of the country's biggest oil field, which produces 300,000 barrels a day. And Russia's control of oil fields and ports means the UN-recognized government in Tripoli can't pay its civil servants. Russian private military contractors are active in 16 African nations. That's according to AFRICOM. Washington has threatened to sanction Haftar, who is a US citizen and a former CIA asset. Haftar owns property worth more than $500,000 in the United States. So, what is Russia's end game? And caught in the middle of all of this are the Libyan people themselves. Let's bring in Francis Giles in Tunis. He's a North Africa analyst and former Financial Times correspondent. Francis, this conflict is turning into a real mess, isn't it? I mean, Russia is printing money for Haftar's political base in the east, and having lost the battle for Tripoli, Russia now seems to be going after the main economic resource, which is, of course, oil.
Well, I think that, in a way, all this is sadly predictable, because when the French took the decision to cheerlead Britain and America into Libya, their intent was to protect the inhabitants of Benghazi, but it quickly turned into an operation to oust Gaddafi. The problem about that is that nobody had thought through the consequences of ousting or murdering the Libyan leader. And so other countries got involved, be it was France, Britain, America, Gulf countries, whatnot. Mercenaries made their appearance very quickly. And then we got this division over the last few years between eastern and western Libya. And so inevitably, like in Syria, if you will, the more the conflict goes on, it turns from a local conflict into an international conflict where every player has their own agenda. And now the Russians, who've used the Syrian crisis very adroitly to come back into the Middle East, or to reinforce their position in the Middle East, which had been weakened after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the Russians are coming back into Libya.
So, Francis, you mentioned the point about mercenaries in your previous answer. We know that Russia is providing and using private military contractors in Libya from the Wagner Group. We understand the group is active in around 16 African countries. How's it being funded, do you think?
Well, the Russians are very good at keeping this kind of thing secret. They're not the only one who use proxies, but the Russians have a powerful state, a powerful military, and a leader determined to get back into the Middle East. So it could be funded from indirectly from the state budget. It could be funded by one of the oligarchs. There are any number of ways you could fund this. And one must remember, of course, that the funding will not go through any kind of traceable Western banking system. So exactly like, with Iran, and there have been other cases, tracing the money is, of course, the way to find out. But before you trace the money, that's virtually impossible.
So let's just talk quickly, if we can, Francis, about some of the key players. Turkey supports the UN-backed government, and now it has its hands on rights to explore for oil and gas off the coast. That's caused a spat because this is disputed territory claimed by Greece.
Well, indeed. Well, the Turks have played their cards, and, whatever one thinks of Turkey, they've played their cards well, because what they've done is that they signed with the government in Tripoli at the beginning of the year a new treaty which redefines the boundaries at sea which are accepted internationally, and they're trying to push their claims on waters closer to Cyprus and to different Greek islands off the coast of Asia Minor. And they're doing this in Tripoli as well. The advantage for their point of view is that it disrupts current oil drilling operations. And even if in 2 or 3 years' time, whichever international authority declares that what Turkey is trying to push is invalid, it has the advantage of disrupting current oil search for oil. That said, this doesn't matter for Europe, because Europe doesn't need the gas. It's particularly gas rather than oil. Europe doesn't need the gas. But I think that from the beginning, there's been a suspicion, and Colonel Gaddafi had said very well before he died that what people were after was the oil and gas of Libya. And they are indeed after Algeria and Angola and Nigeria. They're very, very major reserves, many of which are not even explored properly. So clearly, the Russians are interested, because that gives them extra leverage in the Middle East if they can control some of that oil and some of that gas.
And we have to briefly talk about the United States. It's getting increasingly annoyed at Moscow for supporting Khalifa Haftar. Is Washington then, Francis, throwing its weight behind Turkey's effort to support the GNA?
Well, one gets the impression from the outside that the Americans are playing both sides of the game. It's not very clear. But the Americans, one must remember that, as the title of a book which has just come out says, the unraveling of American hegemony is having all kinds of effect. Because before, there used to be one country, America. If America really put down its foot, everybody would fall into place, be it the Europeans, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, or Russia. Today, a very erratic president who's not particularly interested intervenes from time to time. And therefore, America has lost a lot of clout. And in the case of Libya, particularly, when you're in face of very complex situations, when you are playing against players like Mr. Erdogan or Mr. Putin, who have a very clear end game, whatever one thinks of it, America doesn't seem to have an end game except getting out and from time to time saying, no, we don't like this, no, we don't want this, but that's not a policy. And the disarray of American policy is causing any number of problems.
And the other key player, Francis, is France, which has been supporting Haftar, but is getting increasingly irritated with Turkey's involvement. But do you think France has backed the wrong horse in this conflict?
I think, very frankly, as a Frenchman, I think the French have got it totally wrong from the beginning. Because never forget that President Sarkozy went into Libya for reasons we still don't understand. He went into Libya, boasted about it, used a French writer to proclaim they were going in for freedom and liberty and human rights, and President Sarkozy couldn't care less about human rights. They went into this as some kind of cowboy film, and French diplomacy, I'm afraid, in the last few years, in my mind, is totally ludicrous. And there are many criticisms inside France. What the hell is France doing supporting Haftar? Is that helping the stabilization of the region? In particular, France has very close relations with Tunisia, a country in which I'm staying at the moment. That this is causing enormous problems in Tunisia economically and in terms of fight against terrorism. It's causing problems in Algeria. Have the French thought about their interests in North Africa? The answer seems to be no.
Francis Giles, great to get your thoughts. Thank you for talking to Counting the Cost. Now, a massive explosion has rocked the Lebanese capital, Beirut, leaving many dead and thousands injured. The blast has destroyed the country's main port and left a trail of destruction throughout the city. For a country in the midst of a political and economic crisis, this couldn't have come at a worse time. Lebanon defaulted on its debt earlier this year. It's one of the most indebted countries in the world. Well, the central bank is fast running out of dollars to pay for imports. The currency has collapsed and inflation has soared to almost 90% in June. Hyperinflation has pushed up prices by 190%, poverty is rising, and more than a third of the population are out of work. Well, Lebanon is in talks with the International Monetary Fund for a possible $10 billion bailout. Its usual backers from the Middle East have refused to help the country for fear the money will end up in the hands of Hezbollah. Well, joining me now via Skype from Beirut is Sami Attallah, and Sami is the Executive Director of the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. That's an independent think tank focused on governance, policy and reform. Sami, look, there's so much anger in Lebanon at the political class and corruption that's literally brought the economy to its knees. Do you think this terrible explosion is going to be a game changer, perhaps, for the country?
Darren, it has to be a game changer. We have no choice. We've been trying to reform the system for the last 25 years, and no reforms have been made. And what we just witnessed, this huge explosion a few days ago, this incompetence is actually a product of a political system that is so rotten, so incompetent, that holds no one accountable, and in fact overlooks and undermines people's livelihood. And this one, not only it did not provide them with services, it actually literally killed people. We've got 135 people dead. We've got thousands of injured. We've got property losses. This is huge. And we have a system that actually doesn't care to serve people's welfare. And I think if this is not a game changer, I don't know what will be, because people have actually now are suffering. This political system is actually killing people. So I really hope that this actually will seal the end of this system that we have that actually bears no care or care in terms of providing people's their welfare or their services.
Sami, let's just talk about some of the nations that could help you. What about those Middle East countries like Saudi Arabia that have in the past given financial aid? Are they likely to step up and provide the billions of dollars that it's going to need to stabilize the Lebanese economy?
Look, I don't see that happening. What I see right now, that these Middle East countries are actually providing humanitarian support and relief, medical supplies, which is very needed, and I think we're really grateful for that. But beyond that, I don't see that there will be billions of dollars coming in to stabilize the economy. You know, and this is frankly the product of a failure of the system to reform itself. We have been seeking funds from abroad since 2001, when we first went to Paris to the Paris I conference, which has brought a lot of donors together to provide Lebanon with money to solve its economic and financial problems. That's almost 20 years ago. And since then, we've gone through many conferences and seeking international aid, but the political establishment has actually failed to undertake any of these reforms. And now, we are not, sorry.
Sami, I was going to just say that we know that most of the bad debt is held by local banks. Is it likely that those banks are going to be willing to accept the losses, or is there any space to set up some kind of bad debt bank to hold all the debt together?
Look, just before the crisis or the explosion took place, what Lebanon was actually going through is a major battle on how you distribute the losses, right? The financial losses, because now it has been estimated by this government, we're talking about $83 to $100 billion of losses, which is at least twice to three times the GDP of the country. Now, the banks are actually refusing to bear any of the losses, which I find it shameful. So what they have done is that they have challenged the government, and they have used the parliament and parliamentary committee to undermine the government's plan, which I think is probably more credible in terms of assessing the losses. So what the banks are coming to say that the losses are not as bad or as big because they don't want their equity to be touched. And this is frankly unfair, because what they're doing now is pushing all the losses on citizens and average and low-income people to actually bear the losses of years of mismanagement that they have also benefited from.
So, Sami, what about the IMF? Are they still the banker of last resort? Are they the only game in town?
Frankly, yes. We have been left with no option. Lebanon probably should have sought an IMF probably way earlier. They tried to go to these international conferences, as I mentioned, in 2001 and 3 and 2007, but they failed to undertake any of the reforms. Now, we actually need the liquidity to inject liquidity into the system. And in fact, there's no other option because no other country in the world is planning to give Lebanon billions of dollars as they have done before, because Lebanon and the political establishment, they have failed to do that. In fact, what they have done is actually keep themselves in power. So right now, we are left with no option but to really have these serious, in fact, programs.
Okay.
And what I would argue that we need to negotiate very well with IMF for a program and conditions that actually favor or at least not hurt the average citizens. And in fact, there are many people who are actually the 1% who've made a lot of money and billions of dollars who refuse to share the burden of the cost. And that should be at the heart of any IMF program.
Sami, let me get a final thought from you. I mean, does Lebanon, do you think, need some kind of Marshall Plan to rebuild the capital? And do you think lenders should control the money so that it doesn't fall into the hands of political parties like Hezbollah, etc., if that's a sticking point?
Look, Lebanon does need a Marshall Plan, but not with the current political parties and establishment that are in power. And that includes all the parties, not only Hezbollah, that have been responsible and must be held accountable for the mismanagement of the country for the last 25 years. So yes, we really need that, but not under the conditions or when these people or the same political parties that are in power, because they have failed miserably in actually managing the country. And they have not realized this. They keep on blaming each other as if each one is trying to solve the problem. Well, actually, that's not true. They must be held accountable. And I think we are left with no option but for the Lebanese people to actually democratically overthrow this government and these political parties. And my last thought on that, people should have the courage to actually now step out and actually vote them out of office, because they have been bought.
Okay.
People have been bought through elections. They have been terrified. They've been forced to vote for them as well. So I think this is the time. It's about time that these people actually step up and say they have the courage to vote them out of office so we can rebuild the country.
Sami, so you're talking about ordinary Lebanese people voting out the political classes, but who is capable of stepping up to take over then?
Oh, there are several groups that have actually emerged in the last few years that are actually organizing, preparing their programs, and coordinating together. So I don't think there's a shortage of people or organizations that can take over. And I'm not going to name any because, in fact, this is part of the process. But there are alternatives out there, people that are credible, honest, capable to actually run the country. There are plenty of people who could do so. So it's about time that we actually, get out of this fear that, if I don't vote this leader or that leader, I'm going to be actually negatively affected. And that's how people are afraid to vote them out of office, because they need the protection. And the reason they need the protection is because these same political parties have undermined the state, have undermined the rule of law, that actually make people feel like they need to stick to these leaders to have their rights protected. This actually is nonsense. This is what we need to liberate ourselves from, to build a real state, to build a state that's actually capable to protect citizens, not to be hostage or clients to these zaims and leaders that have actually impoverished us and more recently killed us. And this political establishment has shown after years and years, now with this explosion, that they're not responsible, they have no responsibility or are unable to be held responsible to govern the country, to keep us safe, to keep us, to bring our money back from the banks, that has been stolen as deposits. And that's actually shows you how the political elite and the existing system is not capable to serve people's interests.
Okay, Sami Attallah, very good to get your thoughts. Thank you very much indeed for talking to Counting the Cost. Thank you. Now, who would have thought that liberal countries would have created the very tools that foreign powers would use to undermine them? Authoritarian regimes have used Facebook and Twitter to influence elections and referendums around the world. Russia has been using propaganda and disinformation warfare for the past decade. Special Counsel Robert Mueller indicted Russia's Internet Research Agency for using social media posts, data-driven messaging and analysis to influence the 2016 US presidential election. Separately, the Oxford Internet Institute found evidence of organised social media manipulation campaigns in 48 countries in 2018. It also found that political parties and governments spent more than $500 million on ways to manipulate public opinion over social media since 2010. And data is such a crucial area of contention in President Trump's decision to ban the popular app TikTok. The US fears that user data could be handed over to the Chinese government. Well, let's bring in Sean Gawley. He's CEO and founder of Silicon Valley-based Primer. Primer is an artificial intelligence startup that can summarize reams of data in just seconds. Sean, it seems that disinformation is really going high-tech, isn't it? And countries are deploying all sorts of artificial intelligence and bots that can work around social media defenses. How much of an issue is this, Sean?
Look, we've, I think, crossed a really important scientific milestone in the last 12 months, where we're now able to generate both images, videos, and text that's indistinguishable from what a human can produce. So machines are now indistinguishable from humans, and that gives people who have a desire to manipulate populations the ability to do that at a superhuman scale.
And let's just look forward, Sean, if we can, to this year's US presidential election. How concerned are you? And are you seeing an increase in disinformation from other state actors?
Yeah, look, we've seen, I think, the first experiments in 2016 have now evolved to be very, very proficient actions that take into account not just social media, but go through all sorts of different media channels. And this would kind of characterize this as a manipulation ecosystem. So this has been effectively weaponized and is now being deployed to good effect. And so we're going to see impact in this in the next election for sure.
Are there any lessons that we can learn from the 2016 election that we can pull through to 2020?
Yeah, look, I think the first here is that the technology in 2016 was very, very primitive. We now are at a place where you can automate a lot of these things. And what that means is that you can A/B test messages that have been generated by machines and couple that with pictures that have been generated by machines. And you can A/B test that at the scale of millions to really find targeted messages that are going to appeal to each kind of individual on a very, very personalized basis. So when we've seen that, I think, the technology is going to increase. And in terms of defenses, I think, the major defense that we've got is just educating the population that they are going to be susceptible to large-scale manipulation campaigns.
Sean, let's just talk about the British, if we can, for a second, because we don't know for sure if there was any interference in the UK's Brexit campaign. Does it worry you, though, that there was no real public concern or effort by the British government to launch an inquiry into this?
Well, we do know that there was a large volume of the tweets coming out on social media that were generated by bots, a very, very large number of it. And we know that that likely was from an outside state actor. I do think there should have been an investigation into this. I mean, the reality is if you're a democracy in this world today and you value freedom of speech and you don't want to censor information, you are going to be susceptible to manipulation attacks of the kind that we've seen in the US elections. And I'm sure, we're going to keep seeing. So, this is something that democracies need to take very, very seriously.
Yeah, and Sean, I mean, it does pose the question, doesn't it? Do intelligence services have the resources to tackle these attempts to subvert liberal democracies, do you think?
Yeah, look, there's an asymmetry here. If you look at this from a perspective of the return on investment, it's actually a very, very cheap attack that yields huge kind of disruption. And the reality here is that, it has to be defended against in the same way as you defend against any other attack on a democracy from kinetic weapons. You're going to have to do the same with these kind of information weapons. And, it's something that, defense has now kind of woken up to and is taking very seriously.
And Sean, just to get a final thought from you, how do we know as individuals that we're being targeted?
I think it's safe to assume that you are, and it's your responsibility as a citizen of a democratic country to do everything you can to educate yourself around that. I think it's also a responsibility for the platforms that are serving you information to do everything in their power to make sure that you've got the context for the information that's sitting in front of you. I think the bottom line is it's both on the platforms and it's on us as individual citizens to do our homework.
All right, Sean Gawley, great to get your thoughts. Thanks for talking to Counting the Cost. Thank you. And that is our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or you can drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. And that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Darren Jordan. From the whole team here, thanks for joining us. The news in Al Jazeera is next.